Welcome to another episode. I'm your host, Nabil, and I want to thank you for joining me for this deep dive into a complex and often overlooked aspect of modern geopolitics. Before we begin, I'd like to share a bit of context. I originally wrote this script a few years ago, intending to record it during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Like many of you, I found myself with extra time on my hand during lockdowns, and I decided to use that to explore and share information about topics that I believe deserve more attention. While the pandemic delayed my plans, the subject matter remains as relevant, as important as ever. When most people think of France, what comes to mind? Perhaps you envision a romantic streets of Paris, the iconic Eiffel Tower, standing tall against the twilight sky. Maybe you think of world-class cuisine, fashion houses that define global trends, or a healthcare system often cited as one of the best in the world. These positive associations are not without merit. France has indeed contributed greatly to a global culture, art, sciences, from the halls of Versailles to the sun-drenched beaches of Côte d'Azur, from the Gothic splendors of Notre Dame to the cutting-edge research facilities of the Institut Pasteur. France has long been a nation that captures the global imagination. However, behind this glittering facade lies a dark history. Colonialism, exploitation, and ongoing economic control that continues to shape the destinies of millions of people, particularly in Africa. This is the story we're here to explore today. To kick off, I'd like to share a quote from unlikely source, Luigi Di Maio, a far-right Italian politician who served as a deputy prime minister in 2019. Di Maio made a statement that, while controversial, shed lights on an issue that we'll be discussing. He said, let me get in my character, "The EU should be imposing sanctions on France and all countries like France that impoverish Africa and make these people leave, because Africans should be in Africa, not in the bottom of the Mediterranean. If people are leaving today, it's because of European countries. France, above all, have never stopped colonizing dozens of African countries. France would rank 15 amongst world economies, not in the top 6. Back to character. Now it's important to note that Di Maio's statement comes with its own problematic assumptions and simplifications. However, it highlights a perspective that often overlooked in discussions about European-African relations and migration. The ongoing economic influence of former colonial powers, particularly France. This statement caused a diplomatic row, with France recalling its ambassador from Rome and summoning the Italian ambassador in Paris. It's worth noting that this isn't an isolated incident. France have taken similar actions in recent years with countries like the United States and Australia when it felt its interests were threatened. So was there any truth to Di Maio's provocative claim? To answer that, we need to delve into the history of French colonialism and its evolution in the post-colonial era. Our story begins in the mid-1950s and early 1960s. France, like European colonial powers, was facing inevitable end to its formal empire. Defeats in Indochina and Algeria made it clear that direct colonial rule was no longer sustainable. However, the French political and economic establishment was reluctant to fully relinquish control over its African territories. The solution they devised was both ingenious and insidious. Instead of maintaining direct colonial rule, France would grant nominal independence to its African colonies while keeping them firmly within its sphere of influence. This new system would allow France to maintain its economic interests and geopolitical power without the negative optics and responsibilities of former colonialism. A key figure in establishing this new order was Jacques Foccart, a trusted advisor to President Charles de Gaulle. Foccart was the architect of what came to be known as the Françafrique, a network of political, economic, and military relationships binding France to its former colonies. Under this system, African heads of states were effectively handpicked by Paris. The selection process was discreet but thorough. Potential leaders would first be interviewed by Foccart himself, and if they passed the initial screening, they would meet with de Gaulle. Nothing was ever stated explicitly, but the expectations were clear. These leaders were to put their country's resources at France's disposal, support French position in international forums like the United Nations, and even provide troops to fight in conflicts that served French interests. In exchange, these African leaders received French support to maintain their hold on power. This support could take various forms, from economic aid to military intervention in the case of a coup attempt. However, if a leader stepped out of line or no longer served French interests, they could quickly find themselves replaced by another, more compliant figure. This system allowed France to maintain its access to vital natural resources in Africa. French companies were given preferential treatment, often securing rights to oil, uranium, diamonds, and other valuable commodities. This access to resources had played a crucial role in maintaining France's position as a major economic power. But what happened to countries that refused to play by this rule? The case of Guinea provides a stark example. In 1958, under the leadership of Sékou Touré, Guinea voted for complete independence from France, rejecting de Gaulle's offer for French community that would have maintained significant ties to Paris. The French reaction was swift and brutal. In what can only be described as a collective punishment, the departing French destroyed or removed anything they considered the product of French colonization. This included schools, administrative buildings, research facilities, and even livestock. They burned food stores, sabotaged agriculture equipment, and even, according to some reports, flushed medicine down the toilets rather than leaving them for the Guinean people. The message was clear. Independence from France would come at a terrible cost. This act of spite and destruction was designed to deter other African nations from following Guinea's example. Sadly, it was largely effective. Few African leaders found courage to follow Touré's lead, preferring to accept a compromised form of independence rather than risk the total destruction of their nation's infrastructure. This brings us to another consistent feature of French policy in Africa: military interventionism. French leaders have often framed their military actions in Africa in grandiose ideological terms. During the Cold War, in opposition to pro-French regimes, was often portrayed as a part of a grand communist conspiracy, regardless of the local realities. A prime example of this occurred in 1977 and 1978 when France intervened to save the regime of Mobutu Sissoko in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Mobutu was a brutal dictator, had betrayed rebellion in the Kitanga region as a Soviet-backed plot. In reality, this rebellion was rooted in local grievances and the legacy of earlier conflicts. It received no significant support from the Eastern Bloc. Nevertheless, France used this false narrative as justification for military intervention to prop up Mobutu's regime. A similar dynamic was at play in Rwanda in the early 1990s. The Tutsi-dominated Rwanda Patriotic Front, RPF, invaded from Uganda. French President François Mitterrand and his advisors viewed this as an Anglophone invasion, part of a broader Anglo-Saxon plot to undermine French influence in Africa. This grossly mischaracterized the situation. The RPF invasion was the result of decades of discrimination and violence against Rwanda's Tutsis, many of whom have been living in refugee camps in Uganda. By framing the conflict in Cold War terms, France justified its military support for the Hutu-dominated government of Juvenal Habyarimana. This support continued even as it became clear that elements within Habyarimana's government were planning a genocide against the Tutsi population. When the genocide began in April of 1994, France's role became even more controversial. While French forces did establish a humanitarian zone in southwestern Rwanda, they also allowed many genocide perpetrators to escape into the neighboring Zaire. The Rwanda case illustrates the human cost of France's Africa's policy. By prioritizing its perceived strategic interests over human rights and local realities, France became complicit in one of the worst atrocities in the 20th century. Over the course of just 100 days, an estimated 800,000 to 1 million people were killed. It's crucial to understand that Rwanda's genocide, while particularly horrific, it's not an isolated incident in the history of French colonialism and post-colonial influence. The brutal suppression of the Algerian War of Independence, for instance, resulted in hundreds and thousands of deaths. Some estimates suggest that 5 million people have died in Algeria over the course of 132 years of colonization by France. Now let's return to the economic aspect of Françafrique, which formed the core of the system's ongoing influence. One of the most controversial elements is what's often referred to as the colonial debt. When African countries gained independence, they were often required to pay for infrastructure that had been built during the colonial period. This might sound reasonable on the surface, but it's important to consider the context. Much of this infrastructure was built using forced labor and was primarily designed to facilitate and extract resources for the benefit of France, not for the development of African countries themselves. Togo provides a striking example of how this system works. After independence, Togo agreed to pay the annual debt to France for the supposed benefits of French colonialization. The amount demanded by France was so large that it consumed nearly 40% of Togo's national budget in 1963. Facing this unsustainable financial burden, Togo's first elected president, Sylvanus Olympio, decided to break away from the French colonial currency, the CFA franc, and issue a national currency. This was seen as a direct threat to French interests. On January 13, 1963, just 3 days after Togo began printing its own currency, Olympio was assassinated. The killer was an ex-French foreign legionnaire, Etienne Aidima, who allegedly received a bounty from the local French embassy for the job. Aidima went on to rule Togo as a dictator for 38 years, maintaining close ties with France throughout his reign. This brings us to another disturbing aspect of Françafrique, the frequency of coups in former French colonies. Over the past half century, there have been 67 coups in 26 African countries. Strikingly, 16 of these countries are former French colonies, accounting for about 61% of the coups. Many of these coups were carried out by soldiers with close ties to France, often former members of the French Foreign Legion. Here are just few examples. 1. In Mali, the first elected president, Modibo Keïta, was overthrown in 1968 by Moussa Traoré, a former French foreign legionnaire. 2. In Central African Republic, Jean Bokassa, another ex-French foreign legionnaire, ousted President David Daku in 1966. 3. In Upper Volta, which is now Burkina Faso, Maurice Yamyego was overthrown in 1966. Sangoli Lamizana, who had fought for France in Indonesia and Algeria. 4. In Benin, Mathieu Kiriko, who had attended French military schools, overthrew President Hubert Maga in 1972. These coups often served to replace leaders who were seen as insufficiently compliant with French interests. Even if they weren't openly anti-French, one of the main points of contention was often the requirement for African countries to deposit a significant portion of their foreign exchange reserve in the French treasury. The system, which continues to this day, over a dozen African countries, requires these nations to keep 50%, formerly 65% of their foreign exchange reserve in an operations account managed by the French Treasury. This arrangement, ostensibly designed to maintain the stability of the CFA franc, effectively gives France control over a significant portion of these countries' wealth. The countries affected by this policy are Benin, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Bissau, Côte d'Ivoire, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Togo, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Congo-Brazzaville, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon. It's estimated that France holds close to $500 billion of African countries' money in its treasury. Moreover, these countries are only allowed to access 15% of their money in any given year, and if they need more than that, they must borrow the additional money from the French treasury at market rates. This system severely limits these countries' economic sovereignty and their ability to use their own resources for development. In addition to these economic controls, the Françafrique system includes several other key elements. 1. The right of first refusal of any raw or natural resources discovered in the country. France has the first right to buy any natural resources found in the land of its ex-colonies. Only after France declines are these countries allowed to seek other partners. 2. Priorities for French interests and companies in public procurement and bidding. In the award of government contracts, French companies must be considered first, regardless of whether better value could be obtained elsewhere. 3. The exclusive right to supply equipment and train the country's military officers. Through a system of scholarship, grants, and defense agreements, African countries are required to send their senior military officers for training in France and French-run facilities. 4. The right for France to pre-deploy troops and intervene militarily in the country to defend its interests. Under various defense agreements, France has the legal right to intervene militarily in these African countries and maintain permanent military bases on their soil. 5. The obligation to make French the official language of the country and the language for education. 6. A commitment not to enter into military alliances with any other country unless authorized by France. 7. An obligation to side with France in situations of war or global crisis. The cumulative effect of these policies have been severely constrained the economic and political development of these African nations. While France has benefited from the continued access to resources and maintenance of its global influence, millions of Africans have been left in poverty, subject to authoritarian rule, or forced to flee their own homes. This brings us back to the issue of migration that sparked Luigi Di Maio's controversial comment. Many of the African migrants arriving in Europe, particularly those coming through Italy and Spain, are from West and North Africa, countries that have long been considered France's backyard. These individuals are often fleeing extreme poverty resulting from the economic exploitation we've discussed, or escaping wars and conflicts involving regimes installed, trained, and protected by France. It's a bitter irony that France, which bears significant responsibility for these conditions driving these migrations, has often been amongst the European nations most resistant to accepting refugees and asylum seekers. Over the decades, France has used various justifications for its intervention in Africa. In the colonial era, it was framed as a civilizing mission. During the Cold War, it was about fighting communism. In recent years, counterterrorism have become the primary justification. To be clear, terrorism is a real threat in parts of Africa, particularly in the Sahel region. However, it's crucial to understand how France's historical and ongoing policies have contributed to the instability that allows terrorist groups to flourish. Moreover, the focus on terrorism often serves as a smokescreen, allowing France to maintain its military presence and economic influence while deflecting criticism. As we conclude this exploration of Françafrique, it's important to note that this system, while still powerful, it is not unchanging. There have been efforts at reform under President Nicolas Sarkozy and Emmanuel Macron. Some military bases have been closed, and there's been more acknowledgement of historical wrongs, such as France's role in the Rwanda genocide. However, many critics argue that these changes have just been more cosmetic than anything. The fundamental economic structure remains largely in place, and France continues to intervene militarily in its former colonies, as seen in recent operations in Mali and Central African Republic. Moreover, France is facing increasing competition for influence in Africa, particularly from China and Russia, which have become major investors in and trading partners for many African nations. These shifting landscapes might force further changes in the Françafrique system in the coming years. It's crucial that we look beyond this surface level of these perceptions of countries like France and grapple with these complex realities, understanding the legacy of colonialism and its modern manifestation. The issue we've discussed today, economics, exploitation, political interference, and the driving forces behind global migration, are not just matters for historical interests. They have real ongoing impact on millions of lives and shape the world we all inhabit. So I hope this exploration has provided you with new insight and inspired you to dig deeper into these crucial issues. If you found this information valuable, please consider sharing this podcast. Thank you once again for joining me. This is Nabil signing off. Until next time.